Welcome, YouTube family, and welcome to another video of the Kevin Strong Show. And in this video, we're going to talk about consumer confidence. It's just horrible. It's the worst that it's ever been. I'm going to go through a chart, give you my editorial comment as we go through this chart. Very, very, very practical, good information. But believe it or not, the consumer confidence level really wasn't that bad, especially when you compare it to what's going on right now. But before I get into this chart, I got a story I want to share. There's a good friend of mine who also lives in the Seattle area. We'll just say his name is Marshall. And he and I met each other when I was living in Memphis before I came up here in 2014. And he told me a story that it resonates with me in this regard. How people have such a poor mindset, or they get so comfortable with complacency, they don't see an opportunity that's right in front of them. So what am I talking about? Just bear with me. This is a real story. He just told me about this 2 days ago. I'm going to share the story with you guys, and then I'm going to get into the chart. If you're liking this kind of content, please do me the honor of smashing that like button, commenting, and share, because I care. So here's the story. Marshall has a sister that lives in the Memphis area. She makes about $35,000 a year. Her husband, I think, makes about $50,000 a year, and he is employed by Coca-Cola. So they have a combined household income of about $80,000. The husband makes 50, the wife makes 30, and I think they have a couple of kids. I think 2 boys. So Marshall's telling her about Seattle area. Yes, it is very expensive here. I'm not going to make any editorial comments about the political climate. You can do your own research for that. But he was basically trying to say it's expensive, but given your type of skill set, it may be worth a relocation move from Memphis to Seattle area. So I think his sister has a master's degree for sure, and she may be pursuing a PhD, or she has her PhD. So I'm going to err on the side of caution. Let's just say she has her master's degree. So basically, to make a long story short, Marshall starts to network for his sister and finds out that not only is her particular skill set dealing with some type of mental health and behavioral science is in need, it's in great need. So the lady offers her this is no joke, folks, $130,000 a year, $100,000 raise. Conversely, her husband could relocate from Coca-Cola from Memphis to the greater Seattle area. It's my understanding, coming from, according to Marshall, he says, hey, up here, they're really, really short from a labor standpoint, so he would have to work more hours. And as a result of that, he'd probably make, on the low end, probably 110, possibly even more if he wanted to work more overtime. So let's take easy math. 100,000 plus 130. See where we're at with this now? $230,000 a year in today's economy compared to 80. Now, $80,000 is not a bad salary when you compare it to the cost of living in Memphis, but even $230,000 a year with 2 kids, even as expensive as the greater Seattle area is, it would be a significant upgrade in terms of quality of life, the education, lower crime, maybe not in downtown Seattle, but all jokes aside, there's obviously a lot of good areas. There's really, on a aggregate standpoint, or from a bigger, broader perspective, there's no comparison when you're looking at education, quality of life, and all the other factors that are important to people when they're raising a family, to compare it to Memphis. So to make a long story short, she decided to decline because let's just say there was a certain type of ethnic group that wasn't prominent in the greater Seattle area like it is in Memphis. And because of that, she wanted to raise her kids in a more homogeneous population. I think I cleaned that up quite well. Okay. So once again, mindset, right? Getting out of your comfort zone, doing something that may be a little bit scared, but hey, sometimes you got to take those risks, especially in this particular example, because this was basically, the husband was just doing a job transfer, and this lady was really, really, really upgrading her situation and her career, but decided not to for personal reasons. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this chart. Once again, this is called the University of Michigan's consumer sentiment. So sentiment is worse now, as you can see down here. And this only goes back to July. So we still have to get data for August and September, but it's the worst on record. So we're going to talk about a few things, and I'm going to give you my editorial. So we're going to start back in 1980. Okay. So I'm going to go over here and find not any time during 1980, let's say right here. So some of you who were old enough, I was actually in high school in 1980. I think I was in 10th grade or something like that. I know I'm dating myself, but bear with me. So in 1980, mortgage rates were high. Mortgage rates were really high. They were averaging around somewhere around 17 to 18% in 1980. But what's weird about this, okay, even if you go down here, right, you see where I'm at now, April of 1980, when mortgage rates were 18%, the consumer sentiment was at 52.7. Mortgage rates were still high in October of 1980, and yet still the consumer sentiment went up quite a bit. Now, when you compare the bottom here to right here, it's almost exactly. But let me share this with you. In 1984, okay, the consumer sentiment was at 96.1. It was pretty high. So people were pretty much very optimistic from a consumer sentiment standpoint. In 1984, though, the average inflation rate was only around 4.3%. Okay. So even though consumer sentiment was high, inflation was low. So there are periods in the 80s where inflation really wasn't that bad and consumers were high. Consumer sentiment was high. Obviously, there are some periods during the 1970s all the way down here where inflation was really, really, really bad. Okay. And as a result, it drove consumer sentiment down, but it didn't drive it down to the point of where we're at in April, or as I can get this thing over here if it don't act right. It always does this when I'm doing it live. You guys know where I'm getting at here. Let me see if I can get this thing here. There we go. July of 2022 at 51.5. And this was like 52 something when I was able to get it down here, 52.7. So as you can see, July consumer sentiment is the worst that it's ever been since they've been recording this particular data. What you'll find out a lot of times is when consumer sentiment is high, and I don't have a chart to do an overlay, but you'll find out that housing typically moves in concert when consumer sentiment is high. As you go through here, back during the dot-com bubble, that's when they had all these crazy evaluations for some of these online companies that weren't turning a profit. And that tech bubble, the tech bubble had a massive pop in 2000. So did the stock market crash as well. And as a result, it drove consumer confidence down. However, once again, without me going back over to the chart all the way over here to the right, it still wasn't as bad as what we're experiencing now. Moving forward, going up to 2000 and let's say 8, when we had the great financial crisis, it hit at around roughly, I can't get it. There we go. 55.3 looks like the lowest point. So as I said in a previous video, guys, back from 2008 to 2012, the Federal Reserve was lowering interest rates, but home prices in aggregate were still going down. The housing market in aggregate really didn't start to get out of its funk until around 2012. And as you can see here, that's when we had a big shoot up increase in consumer sentiment. I'm going somewhere with this because I'm building a premise here. So it was really, really low in 2011. And then in 2012, when consumer sentiment picked up, guess what started to turn? The housing market came out of its trough and started to ascend upward. And we kept going upward with quantitative easing. Let me throw that in there as a caveat. With quantitative easing, all the way up until we got around 2020, the healthcare pandemic came out, and obviously that took consumer confidence down. What did the Fed do? The Fed said, oh, we're going to inject some more quantitative easing. We're going to do this in overdrive. We're going to do quantitative easing on steroids. And as a result, what happened? Consumer sentiment came all the way up. I can never get this thing to do that. But you see here where my mouse is pointing at. And what has happened? It has rolled over and has come all the way down to a historic level, which I believe I was at like 52.7. My point is, by me explaining all of this and going through some of these benchmark points, like in 1984, 2000, and then from 2008 to 2012, sentiment went up, so did the housing market, and now we see consumer sentiment the worst it's been on record. So it is not out of the realm of possibilities to say if consumer sentiment is at an all-time low and it's crashing, that's a crash. That's a violent downturn. We don't have a downturn that bad. We have some swings going up, but we don't have a downturn that bad since what? 2008. And the big violent dissension from 2006 to 2008, that line is still not as bad as this line right here. It's close, but this still is a little worse. So what I'm saying in summary is that my opinion is that because consumer sentiment is at one of its lowest points, or is at its lowest points recorded, don't be surprised if the housing market follows suit, because historically speaking, consumer sentiment is kind of a bellwether or a tell to the overall pulse. I can't talk. That's my Midwestern accent coming on. It gives you a heartbeat of where housing market in general, in aggregate, if it's going up and down, because when people feel confident about the economy and their job, they make goods and services. The debt market is working. There's liquidity working, and people are purchasing assets. I don't think that's going to happen. Finally, last but not least, there is a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And this is by Andy Grove, who is the co-founder, I believe, of Intel. So I thought that was very interesting. Only the paranoid survive. Because if you're damned to torpedoes, always full steam ahead, and you always do this and you always do that, and if you're right, okay, great. But if you're wrong, you may put yourself out of business. But if you're a little bit paranoid and he says, you know what? I'm going to just put my toe in the water and get a good sense of the temperature of the water. And then I'm going to slowly ease in. I have the same objective as the guy who jumped in. I just don't want to make sure I drown. And I think that's a very prudent approach to take, not only with your finances, but especially as it applies to real estate. I think that you should basically slow down, use more due diligence. I am an overall advocate of real estate, and I think anybody that comes from a middle class background or below, it's probably one of the fastest ways to accumulate wealth. So I am all in on real estate, but I'm just a guy who only the paranoid survive. I just want to tip my toe in it a little bit, or maybe just sit back and observe for 6 to 12 months and then jump in. That's fine if you get a little bit ahead of me and decide that, hey, see, if you would have jumped in it in September of 2022, Kevin, you'd have X plus 6. But because you waited till 2023 or 2024, you only have X plus 2. That's only okay if things turn out to be all right and you have that full steam ahead mentality. But if you're on the elevator and I got off and you're laughing at me, but you're still on the elevator when the cable snaps, guess where you end up? At the bottom, homie. So that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed this type of content, the story that Marshall shared with me about just giving up just a tremendous opportunity. I hope I made a lot of sense for you guys about that consumer sentiment chart, because it's very powerful, because consumers kind of dictate what happens with markets. And I think because consumer sentiment is heading down, the housing market's going to follow suit. If you're enjoying this kind of content, please do me the honor of smashing that like button, commenting, and share, because I care. This was the Kevin Strong Show, and I'll see you guys in the next video.